Whether you've been tracking the development of COVID variants or tracking your ancestors, the genetic material used to do that work is considered gold in the biomedical industry. But once your DNA is in the lab, who owns it? And is the information gleaned from it safe? Let's ask. In North Vancouver, British Columbia, Tania Bubela. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, who researches health and biotechnology law and policy. And in the downtown of Ontario's capital city, there's Jim Woodgett, who is President and Scientific Director of the Terry Fox Research Institute and Senior Scientist based at the Lunenfeld Tannenbaum Research Institute at Sinai Health. And it's great to have you two on our program this evening. I want to just read a little excerpt from a magazine article that came out a few years ago by Timothy Caulfield and Blake Murdoch to set up our discussion. So here we go. We live in a fascinating and potentially precarious time, they write. On the one hand, there continues to be escalating growth, investment, and excitement surrounding biobanking. Across the globe, millions of individuals have been recruited to participate in these complex, expensive research platforms, and the potential scientific and health benefits are undoubtedly real. On the other hand, there remains a deep lack of clarity around basic legal and ethical principles. The public is supportive, but that support appears tentative and conditional on the maintenance of trust. And that's where we will pick up our discussion. And it's not just biobanks, obviously. We hand over our DNA all the time to commercial genealogy firms such as 23andMe, or to a lab for genetic testing, or we might be asked to take part in a medical study which requires this. So there's sort of myriad ways our genetic information is, quote unquote, out there. The question is, once it's out of our hands, Tania, why don't you start on this? How secure is that information?
It depends on where you've sent it and who has it. And so I would say in Canada, in either a clinical context, so the data, who has the data, are the health authority custodians that are the data stewards of your genetic test results. So in the clinical context, or in the research context, sometimes that data is stored within a university in a research lab, and sometimes it is contributed to a larger initiative such as a biobank. In both of those contexts, the data are heavily protected by legislative frameworks, ethical principles controlled by research ethics boards. So there's a very strong governance framework, and I would say that the data is fairly well protected. When you send your data to a company, you need to read the fine print, and there it is a little bit of the Wild West, especially when you're sending it across the border to the United States or elsewhere. And there your data are far less protected, and you need to be aware of what the terms and conditions of the use and the storage of your data actually are.
Jim, I'll get you to weigh in on the same question.
Well, Tania has answered it really well. The key word that she mentioned is custodian. So if you are submitting your data, for example, you're consenting to a clinical trial, or you're participating in a study, the healthcare institution or the university has to act as a custodian, which means they have to act in your interest to protect that data. And that's because the data is very valuable, but it also could potentially be used for uses which you hadn't consented to. So they need to make sure that any use of that tissue or that information is appropriate. And having said that, it's very important also when one consents and when one participates in these sorts of studies, you're asked to fill in what's called an informed consent form. Then what you should do is make sure that the consent form includes the appropriate information for that person to make the judgment as to whether or not they want to participate in the study. And we actually, as scientists, depend on the people, the citizens of the country, participating in these clinical studies, because otherwise we wouldn't make very significant progress in medical research. So it's a bargain, as it were. We need to keep the trust of the patients who are participating, and we also need to give them the security of that information that they're donating to us.
Well, that's prompted a follow-up, and Tania, I'll put it to you. Custodian. If they're the custodian of, let's say, my information, does that mean they own it, or do I still own it?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So property is a bargain, Jim used that word, between society and the property holder, and it's set up within a legal framework. So it's a three-way relationship between a thing or the property, the owner of the property, and the state that sets up the legal framework to enable the property ownership. And data doesn't really have one. So data falls within what we would call kind of this knowledge domain, which would fall under the legal constructs of intellectual property. And intellectual property covers specific things, and data in general would fall kind of under under copyright, right? So it's a thing. It's knowledge that is codified or sort of spelt out in text or in code. So it falls under copyright. But under copyright, data doesn't meet the definition of what is entitled to copyright. So it's this really weird thing in that no one really owns the data, but that doesn't take away the fact that you have an interest in it, because it is data that is about you, and it can affect your life, your finances. It can affect it's health information. It's integral to who you are, and you have an interest in it, but you don't own it. So nor does the doctor that collects it from you. So the way that the courts sort of think about it is in this weird area of law. It's kind of trust law, and they have a fiduciary obligation to protect it, because you have this inherent interest in it, because it's data about you and it affects you. So ownership is a shorthand, but in the legal sense, it really is much more about this custodial trust relationship, where you give up information about yourself, partly to be used for your benefit in a clinical context or in research that may benefit you or people like you, or to a company through a contractual relationship where in return you're getting services such as data about your ancestors.
Okay.
So it really is in this gray zone. It's a legal gray zone, right? But it's much more in this area of that Jim was talking about, this area of trust between the person and the custodian that's holding the data for your benefit.
Now, Jim, that's fascinating because, and maybe you could tell me how problematic you think it is that this really isn't 100% nailed down, this notion of ownership.
Well, I think one of the problems is that our hospitals, are given this responsibility to ensure that the data is kept secure and is appropriately used, and that can mean they can basically be ultra careful, too careful, and not want to share that data, even if it's in a very appropriate circumstance. And as we know, science really requires lots of collaboration and working between scientists and between institutions. And so one of the downsides of this is if it's overinterpreted, and typically you want to not do things, it's safer than doing things, then you can actually put in barriers which were unintended, and actually were unintended by the donors, by the patients who are providing the information in the first place. And so that can actually weaken the ability to do certain types of research and therefore have good outcomes.
Tania, I may have this, as it was described, custodial relationship with, let's say, 23andMe, or with, let's say, a hospital that may be doing a research project and is using that kind of information for the benefit, I guess, of me and others. But what about, let's say, an insurance company that might want access to that information? Do I have that same kind of custodial relationship with them?
So that's very interesting. So Canada has relatively recently passed a Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. So it started off in about 2013. Senator Cowan brought that forward. It was finally made it through, passed as sort of a private member's bill in 2017. Quebec, of course, challenged it because we have this split jurisdiction in healthcare. between the provinces and the federal government. And so they said that the federal government putting in laws about genetic information was overreach, that outside of their jurisdiction. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court disagreed with Quebec and said that it was the proper use of the criminal law power of the federal government, because it was preventing a harm and it had incarceration or penalty in place. And there it prevents you having to give your genetic information in exchange for contracts, such as insurance contracts. So your employer and your insurer can't use your genetic information against you. That is your sequence information. But it exempts research and clinical uses. Now, there's a rub there, because the first thing that insurance companies do, of course, is collect your family history. So they ask you a really detailed questionnaire of not only about your health, but about the health of your parents, your siblings. And in essence, what they're doing there is collecting your genetic information without getting the code.
Well, but they're asking you, and you're presumably willingly giving that information, and you're presumably telling the truth when you give that information. Jim, I guess the difference here is that if you get the actual DNA sequencing, there's no fudging, right? You got it dead to rights there.
Yeah, absolutely. So each of us have, each of our cells has 3.1 billion so-called nucleotides, our genomic sequence, which can be easily put onto a USB drive. It's a tiny amount of information, but it describes, in essence, your genetic fingerprint. But you don't even need that level of detail. And as we've seen with companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, as has been the case in, for example, forensic determination of long unsolved murders, you can actually interpolate missing bits of information. So you can actually identify from, in cold cases, can identify genetic material collected at that time, and find the potential pool of the potential murderers. So I think that's a really important concept there, that you don't necessarily need all the complete information to actually be able to piece together sufficient information to identify a person, as long as you've got other information. And it's ironic in many respects when if I, for example, consent to submitting my genome to a public database for the public good, am I consenting just myself, or am I consenting my kids, their kids in the future? Because you can interpolate to a certain degree the genetic information which they're going to carry. And of course, that is recognized in the genomic sciences, and we are quite careful about that in the consenting, and forewarn people, and actually sometimes give them actually a quiz that they understand what they are actually consenting to. That's not necessarily the same with some of the commercial companies, and often they do have these end user agreements, like these software agreements, which are pages and pages long. And I don't think I've ever met anybody, apart from a lawyer maybe, and Tania probably does this, who's actually read through these things. And so we often consent to things that we don't necessarily understand or appreciate what we're consenting to.
All right, let me circle back to something that Tania said off the top, which is that often this information goes to, and I think you described it as sort of well-secured, ethically bound post-secondary institutions, for example, or commercial enterprises, which you said maybe just a little bit sketchier in the way that they follow all these rules. So I want to follow up on that. How are research studies, for example, governed to ensure that everybody acts ethically when they get this very personal, private information of yours?
Sure. So Jim has mentioned a few of these things. So the first things for example, we're setting up a biobank right now with McGill University at the Montreal Neurological Institute for motor neuron diseases. So we are in the process of starting recruitment of individuals who have been diagnosed with a motor neuron disease to contribute their biological material and their health data to a biobank so that we can study motor neuron diseases for diagnostics and therapeutic development. So what do? Well, the first step in the process is an application for funding, and it's funded by Brain Canada, partnered with a couple of biotechnology companies and the patient organization. The next step in the process is to get the consent in place. This is a 15-page consent document that not only covers all of the sampling that is going to be done with these patients, but that covers what we call a consent to governance. So this is the consent for the process by which the samples are going to be governed in terms of how they're deposited, how they're stored, what they can be used for, who makes decisions about who can access them and for what purposes. And so it's quite a complex thing. And then after that, there are interinstitutional agreements between all of the institutions that are the clinical collection sites and the biobank. And then, of course, you want to look at sustainability beyond the terms of the study. These samples are hugely valuable, and you want to make sure that they're in a place that will live beyond the lifespan of the study so that they can be accessed and used for the purpose for which they were collected. And so all of that needs to be in the consenting documents approved by a research ethics board and heavily regulated within an institutional context.
Well, why don't we do a real life example here? Jim, you're with the Terry Fox Research Institute. You're overseeing the Marathon of Cancer Network. This is a study. What are you trying to find out?
Yes, it's actually the Marathon of Hope Cancer Center Network. And actually, so let me backtrack a little bit. We've got some fantastic cancer research centers in Canada, the Princess Margaret BC Cancer Agency, McGill Cancer Center, and many others. And each of those, a few years ago, realized that they don't see enough patients in order to get the statistical significance to answer key questions, such as, if there are small populations, subpopulations within patients who develop, for example, breast cancer, prostate cancer, et cetera, they don't see enough of those patients to be able to see the patterns in the information. And so they and we got together to try to form a national network between these various cancer centers. And that provided the opportunity to then significantly enhance the numbers of patients who will be involved in these studies. And we're actually working with support from the federal government to collect about 15,000 genomic profiles from patients with all different sorts of cancer, from childhood cancer through to pretty much any sort of cancer. And what we found over the past maybe 5-10 years is that even though you may have a particular cancer which is diagnosed in where it was found, for example, in a breast cancer, that a small fraction of those cancers actually look just have molecular defects, which are also found in other cancers from other tissues. And we have drugs against those. And so if you can identify the molecular lesion, regardless of whether or not it's a brain cancer or a colon cancer or whatever, then that is often much more effective than using the typical generic type of treatment, the chemotherapy type treatment, which attacks the property of the cancer to divide. So normally cancers are threatening because they divide and they grow and they obstruct important organs and that sort of thing. So these molecular targeted drugs are much more effective in many respects. They have fewer side effects and they're very, very targeted. The problem is that they are also quite rare, right? So we need to look at thousands of samples rather than a few hundred, which is typical in a clinical trial. So that required then the collaboration between institutions, between provinces across the country. And every institution, as we talked about right at the beginning, has a feeling that they need to, well, not a feeling, they have an obligation to protect the data that they have. And so this requires them then to make sure that for the benefit of the patients, the ultimate benefit of the patients, we are able to collaborate and exchange that data and that information. So the Marathon of Hope Network is really trying to pull together and have a common data bank, as it were, which is still highly protected, to allow those questions, those deeper questions, to be asked. And the way that we do that is by actually the data doesn't move. The data stays in those custodian centers, but we can query it using various appliances, data analysis appliances, and therefore we can maintain the safety, as it were, and the privacy associated with those data sets.
Gotcha. I'm going to read one more thing from that Caulfield Murdoch article, and then Tania, I'll get you to comment on this. This again goes back to the issue of trust. One of the key goals of biobanks is to produce technologies and drugs that will be used in the healthcare context. Industry will inevitably be involved, particularly as the work gets closer to clinical application. High maintenance costs mean that many biobanks must turn to industry for funding support, which some fear could affect the independence and integrity of research or result in changes in the use of data or samples that are inconsistent with existing consents. The inevitability of increased industry involvement creates the potential to erode public trust and to intensify the challenges associated with consent and sample ownership. Okay, Tania, are there activities going on in the private sphere that have you concerned?
Yeah, so this is an issue because if we are going to develop new drugs and diagnostics, at some point there is the need for industry to be involved. They're the ones with the expertise, the commercial expertise, the expertise to take things through the regulators, the regulatory process, and the expertise in things like medicinal chemistry. We're not going to get scale up of things that are done in research institutions unless industry is a partner. And so again, it comes down to this notion of is that clear in the consent form, that the samples that you are donating or that you are contributing to a resource will be involved, will be used, could be used by industry. We now have the capacity to get much more sophisticated about what consent looks like. Consent doesn't need to be a one-time decision point when your sample is put into a biobank. We now have the ability technologically to look at dynamic consent and to ensure that packets of information have their consent criteria attached to them. Do you want them used for this purpose, but not that purpose? Do you want them used by industry or not, right? So the other part of it is that it is incredibly essential to have patients as partners through the entire process. So, for example, for setting up the Terry Fox network, for setting up our biobank with ALS, the patients are partners in the governance process. So they need to be, part of the decision making along the way.
Okay, let's finish up on this. Joseph Uriqueta is an Indigenous American biomedical health disparities researcher. And he recently said this on CBC Radio. He said, "So just like we were exploited for land and crops, medicines and gold and oil, we will be exploited for the biological treasures that are in our genome." Jim, finish us up on this. What does he mean by that?
Well, I mean, historically, we had all sorts of examples of where researchers have gone into, for example, Indigenous communities or remote communities. There's so-called helicopter science, where they've taken blood samples and other samples and then done some analysis, and they've learnt lots of information, but the communities from which they took that information didn't benefit. And in fact, there was no participation, there was no feedback. So nobody looped back and said, we found this, we found that you are a higher susceptibility. And what the remarkable thing is, I think this is why Canada is well positioned in terms of looking at the new targets, for example, for all sorts of not just cancer research, but cancer treatments, but also in other diseases, neurodegenerative and heart disease, for example. our diversity, our population diversity is remarkable. And so we are a sampling of many genetic experiments, as it were, which are us. And that, of course, includes the indigenous populations. It includes the many immigrants who've come from around the world. And if we don't have them as part of the database, then we're not able to incorporate their learning from their genomes, but also they won't benefit. So the part of this which has been missed, I think, for many years, was that there was no reciprocal relationship. There was no benefit for those communities.
It's a fascinating topic, fraught with numerous pitfalls, which of course adds to why it is so fascinating. And I'm glad you two were able to spare some time for our viewers tonight to talk about this. Tania Bubela at Simon Fraser University, Jim Woodgett at the Terry Fox Research Institute and Sinai Health. Good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.